The Jets will miss the playoffs for a 12th straight season. What went wrong? Well, there were some things that were in the Jets' control. There were other things that were out of the Jets' control. And we will discuss all of them on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, January 3rd, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. And first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Well, I think everybody is focused on the horrible event last night in the game between the Buffalo Bills and the Cincinnati Bengals. The game was suspended during the first quarter, a terrifying moment during that game. Damar Hamlin, a Bills safety, went into cardiac arrest, and as of the recording of this podcast, is in critical condition. I was traveling yesterday home from the holidays. I mentioned last week that I was in California and San Diego for the holidays, so my flight home was last night, and when I landed, I put my phone on and I saw the news, and it just utterly horrific. My first memory of the NFL came before I was old enough to really know what was going on, but it was when Dennis Byrd got injured. And if you're too young to remember Dennis Byrd, he was a Jets defensive lineman who was paralyzed in the 1992 game against the Kansas City Chiefs. And fortunately, Dennis Byrd was able to walk again. Tragically died in a car accident in 2016. But I just remember that game and how I remember my father was really upset. I really wasn't old enough to know what was going on, but I knew something bad had really happened. And when I think about what happened last night, my memory goes to that. There are no words, and we certainly hope that he pulls through. And I really don't know what else to say. And we are a Jets podcast, so we are here to talk about the Jets today, but I felt at the top of the show we needed to talk about what happened last night and just, hope for the best, because that's as scary of a moment as you'll see on an NFL field. It's as scary of a moment as you'll see anywhere on or off an NFL field, and all you can do is just hope that that he pulls through. Anyway, we are here to talk about the Jets today. And the Jets, of course, lost in Seattle on Sunday, and that eliminated them from the playoffs for a 12th straight season. So today we're going to talk about what went wrong, why the Jets are missing the playoffs after they started 5-2. They were 6-3 at one point. They were 7-4 entering the month of December, and they've not won a game since. Thanksgiving weekend, they beat the Bears to go 7-4. Felt like they were in the driver's seat for the playoffs. And the thing that's frustrating is Jets really lost their playoff spot. Nobody came and took it from them. It's not like the Jets played decent ball and some other team got hot. Now there were teams that got hot, but there was still the last playoff spot was there to be taken for the New York Jets. They just haven't won games. And if the Jets played 500 ball from the start of December, they'd be in the playoffs right now. So what went wrong? Well, there are some things that are in their control. There are some things that are out of their control. So let's start by talking about the things that were in the Jets' control. And I think, I spent an extensive amount of time on yesterday's game recap talking about it, but I think reason number one the Jets are missing the playoffs is they just did not get good enough play from the quarterback position. Entering the season, there was this debate, what's the bigger priority? Is it winning games, making the playoffs, or is it developing Zach Wilson? Well, unfortunately, they got neither, and it's one led to the other. And that's one of the reasons I think those questions can be a little bit deceiving, because it makes it sound like quarterback play is completely is completely separated from your end result, when in reality, your quarterback play has a lot to do with the end result. Now, of course, there were some games the Jets won this year, even though they did not get very good quarterback play, but there's a huge overlap. And this season, the Jets ended, or at least right now, the season's not over, but through 17 weeks, the Jets as a team have the lowest passer rating in the league. If you look at team passer ratings, Jets are lowest in the league. And how much does that hurt a team? Well, let me give you the other teams that are at the bottom. So the Jets are 32. They have a 75.5 passer rating. The next worst team is the Houston Texans, the team that's probably going to be the number one pick in the draft. 30th is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, Steelers are having a decent season, so maybe things aren't that bad. But then let's go up the list. Indianapolis is the next team. Denver after them. Arizona. Chicago. I mean, this is a who's who of the worst teams in the NFL. And it shows you that there's a pretty big correlation between you not getting good quarterback play and losing. And it also shows you that the Jets at 7-9, well, they can thank their defense for that, because and maybe we I think in many ways the defense has been a bit underappreciated what they did this year, because I just gave you that list of teams. Those are the teams at the bottom of the league. I'll read them again. Jets at the very bottom, Houston, Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Denver, Arizona, Chicago. Those are the bottom teams in the league, and the Jets are at the very bottom. All of those teams except Pittsburgh are horrible this year. So it shows you that the Jets just did not get enough out of the quarterback position, because this is a defense that could have taken the Jets a long way. And I think that we maybe undersell how great they were during that 4-game winning streak, where they dominated opponents, even though the Jets weren't getting a lot out of their passing game. So that's something you look at, and it's all three quarterbacks who. So I guess Streveler played a little bit against Jacksonville, but all three quarterbacks really had games where they gave the Jets no chance to win. And I think it began week 1 with Joe Flacco under center against the Baltimore Ravens. And I think week 3, Flacco, again, cost the Jets a pretty winnable game. Zach Wilson, I can tell you both games against New England were ugly. Jacksonville, that was not any good. So Mike White comes in. And he obviously plays very poorly against the Seattle Seahawks. The Jets were searching for an answer all year long and simply could not find it. And I go back to this. I don't want to crush Mike White, because he far exceeded what reasonable expectations are for a guy in Mike White's shoes, a guy who's really bounced between the practice squad and the active roster for years, a late-round pick by another team who gets waived. He comes to your team and plays a couple decent games. One great game against Chicago, a great game against Cincinnati last year, a couple decent games against Buffalo and Minnesota. It's tough to get on him. The issue is that Zach Wilson just failed to develop. And that's the reason that's the reason the Jets had to lean on a guy like Mike White. So you look at it, to me, this is the number one reason. I don't think you can understate how important it would be for the Jets to just get decent quarterback play this year, because you look at what the defense did, and they gave you enough. Now, you do have some nitpicks with the defense. I can nitpick a couple things with the defense. They did not force a lot of turnovers the second half of the season after the bye. So that's number one. Number two, last couple of weeks, it hasn't been good. They gave up the touchdown, and I understand it was otherwise a really good performance against the Hot Lions offense, but their big breakdown, that was perhaps a season-changing breakdown against the Detroit Lions. And then the last 2 weeks, they were not good. So I think the one criticism you can have of the defense is that they played their worst ball at the least opportune moment. And I think in many ways, this was a team-wide failure, though, because I think you could also look at special teams. Jets are the only team in the NFL that have allowed 2 punt returns for touchdowns this year. They both were really costly. One was in a loss to Detroit, where the defense otherwise shut Detroit down. And listen, then if you followed the flow of that game, I said it at the time, the offense and defense put the punting unit in a bad spot, but still no reason for a bad punt there. Or you still doesn't guarantee a bad punt if you're in a bad spot. And beyond that, they lost a game in New England, which again, quarterback was the number one reason, but they gave up a punt return touchdown. Braden Mann, not delivering in year 3. So another reason the Jets failed. And I'll give you one more. This sophomore class did not develop the way you wanted them to. There were 2 guys who played well. Elijah Vera Tucker before he got injured, and Michael Carter II developed into a really good slot corner. But you did not get anywhere near the type of season you were looking for Elijah Moore. And you did not get anywhere near the type of season you were looking for from Michael Carter, who was supposed to kind of slide into like the change of pace role when Breece Hall was there. But after Breece went down, you felt, at least I felt good about the situation because you still had Carter, but Carter just did not deliver this year. So, you look at the things the Jets could control, there's a lot that they're going to look back on with great regret because these are the things that really, as much as anything, cost the Jets a spot in the playoffs. Of course, there are some things you can't control in the NFL season. And as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll discuss some of the bad breaks the Jets got. And there were some. And these are also contributing factors to the Jets missing the playoffs this year. We'll go into it more as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. And if you're a Jets fan, maybe you'd be better expecting Jets players to perform less than their projection. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. And if you're a Jets fan, maybe you should expect offensive players to score less than their projection. I'll leave that up to you. But you should know that there's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. And PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you want to watch. So if you're too nervous to pick Jets opponents, you don't want to deal with the NFL, you also have the NBA, you have the NHL, you have college football, you have men's and women's college basketball, you got esports, tennis, MMA, boxing, and disc golf. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's just that easy, and they have safe and fast withdrawals. They are currently operational in over 30 states and Canada as well. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. So if you deposit $50, PrizePicks gives you $50. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks gives you $100. And don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for an instant deposit match of up to $100. Thanks again for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. Subscribe to the Locked On NFL podcast and get daily conversations on the biggest NFL stories, plus in-depth analysis of the biggest games with NFL key predictions every Friday. And Monday, local insiders cover the weekend with game-to-game episodes. Locked On NFL, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about reasons the Jets will miss the playoffs for a 12th straight season. And there are plenty of things you can point to. The Jets have a lot that they have to account for. A lot of the Jets' failure to make the playoffs is self-inflicted, but there were some bad breaks along the way. Now, I hate blaming injuries because everybody's got injuries, but the Jets had injuries in places you could not afford to have them. They lost Breece Hall at a moment where Breece Hall was not just the best player. Breece Hall essentially had become the offense in this 3-game stretch. He was every bit as good as advertised his rookie season coming out of Iowa State, and he really was picking things up, and he suffered that injury against Denver. But also in that Denver game, Jets had to deal with something else. Elijah Vera Tucker went down. And to that point in the season, those were the 2 best offensive players the Jets had, and the offense was the weaker unit on the team. And the Jets were able to weather the storm in the Denver game, and they were able to get enough the next couple of weeks. But I think down the stretch, it just became too much. And I don't think the Jets were like overly injury prone this year. They just had injuries at spots they could not afford them. You look at the offensive line. How many times did the Jets have guys get injured up front, especially at the tackle position? And while they got some of these guys back, they were constantly reshuffling the offensive line. That's tough. It's tough when you have a different offensive line group every week because the offensive line is a spot where you really, really, really need chemistry. It's really tough to pull it off on the offensive line if you're constantly changing your groupings every week because you got to know what the guy next to you is going to do. If there's a stunt, you got to know how to pass him off. You got to know at what point you're going to pass it off. You need awareness. You need communication. And it's just impossible to build that. And you look at some of the Jets offensive line struggles, especially as we approach November and December. Some of them, not all of them. Well, listen, they're playing backups, but they also got some guys back who should be decent players. But some of it's just a lack of communication. That I think you can go back to looking at a lack of chemistry. So I don't think it's a great excuse, but I do think it played a role. I think injuries played a role. I think another issue for the Jets is they just had ridiculously bad fumble luck this year. Recovering fumbles is not a skill. Some people will argue it is. There's no skill in it. I mean, it's a lot. So maybe there's a little bit of hustle to it. Maybe there's an element of that, but for the most part, fumble recoveries are just about luck. And I talked about how the defense wasn't forcing a lot of turnovers in the first segment. Well, the Jets on the defensive side of the ball had the worst fumble luck in the league. They recovered only 22% of fumbles forced on defense. On offense, they were a little better. They were still below average recovering their own fumbles. But on defense, it's unbelievable how unlucky the Jets were, recovering less than 1 out of 4 fumbles. A fumble should be a 50-50 proposition. So you look at that. That's the worst luck in the league. So that's up there as well. And another point I want to make about the Jets, how they kind of fell off the second half of the season. Well, I think you have to look at the schedule. And it's interesting because people who want to dismiss what the Jets did in the first half of the season, they say, oh, well, the Jets played a bunch of backup quarterbacks. And that's true. And that's part of the story. But it kind of neglects what happened in the second half of the season. Over the course of the full season, the Jets' opponents had a .532 winning percentage. That's in the top 5 of toughest schedules in the NFL. In fact, I'll tell you something else. Since 2 weeks before the bye, so that was the game against New England where the Jets' winning streak ended. How's this for a stat? How's this for a point? The Jets have played one game against a team with a record currently under 500. And that was the game against Chicago where the Jets won it handily. That's tough. I mean, listen, you want to be in the playoffs, you got to win tough games. You got to protect your home field in December. So I don't want to make it sound like that's a blanket excuse because there were winnable games. Jets could have even won a game or two on the road in December. They could have gone up. They very easily could have beaten the Minnesota Vikings if they played a better first quarter. If any one of 3-4 things happens in the fourth quarter of that game, you got to come through. And part of the story is that the Jets failed to come through in the big moment. However, I think it is fair to point out that this was a tough schedule this year. You look collectively, it's very easy to say, well, the Jets got a bunch of backup quarterbacks early. Well, are you also pointing out that the Jets had a tough schedule later on? Because I think to be fair, you have to balance those two out. It's perfectly fine if you want to say the Jets benefited from an easy schedule in the early part of the season, especially all the backup quarterbacks they faced. I think it's part of the story. But part of the story is also that, and it's not the whole story. Again, you got to win games. I think that there has to be some degree of nuance in here where maybe you don't take all the credit away for the Jets for winning those games early on against backup quarterbacks, but you say, hey, you know what? Jets benefited from their early schedule. On the same note, you don't look at this and say, well, these games were completely unwinnable. It's totally excusable that the Jets lost these games late in the season because the schedule was so tough. I don't think you can do that. But I do think, on the same note, you look at this and you say, that was a tough finish to the Jets. The Jets could have benefited a little bit more from scheduling luck, and unfortunately, they did not. So we've talked about some of the things that broke the Jets, some of the things that the Jets were responsible for. We talked about some of the bad luck that they suffered. Is it the Jets' fault that they missed the playoffs? Is it just bad luck? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we close out this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get all the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From pro football to college bowl season to basketball and the World Cup, they've got it all at BetOnline.net. And if you think the Jets will finish the season strong, you can put some money down on the season finale against Miami. Jets have to go down to South Florida, a road game, trying to sweep the Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins quarterback situation, once again, just as it was in the first meeting, seems up in the air. Well, they are BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to get all your sports betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday, talking about the Jets missing the playoffs for the 12th straight season. I've gone through all the reasons I could come up with that the Jets will be home for the playoffs, even after being 3 games over 500. There were 2 to 3 games over 500, really, from the month of October through the beginning of December. Very frustrating to be at home for the playoffs. And, I listed the reasons that were their fault. I listed the things that worked against them. So is it the Jets' fault? Is it not their fault? I tend to put more blame on the Jets because I think in the NFL, there are always the things you can control and the things you can't control. And there's no use worrying about the things you can't control because you can't control them. I always believe that your result ultimately is based on the combination of these two things: the situations that are presented to you, and what you do with those situations. And while I can have some degree of sympathy for the Jets, again, there were bad injuries. That's part of the story of the season. They did play a tough schedule, and the fumble luck was bad. And one or two fumble recoveries at key spots in some of these games could have turned them. It could have changed the entire season. Ultimately, though, the Jets just were not good enough to make the playoffs this year. And I hate making excuses, especially excuses like this, because yes, listen, it hurt the Jets badly, and maybe they make the playoffs with Brees and Elijah Vera Tucker still in the lineup. Maybe they make the playoffs if they get a few more easy games at the end of the season. But they were still right there. They were still right there in that game in Minnesota. They were right there in that game against Detroit. And with their season on the line, the last 2 weeks, Thursday night at home against Jacksonville, late season home Thursday night game. Late season home Thursday night game. So it's always tough to travel on the road for Thursday night football because you essentially can't prepare at all. It's tough to prepare at home, but going on the road, it's a huge disadvantage. Jets had Jacksonville at home, and they came out and pretty much no-showed. And then with everything on the line, they were playing a Seattle team that was struggling maybe worse than they were entering that game. The Detroit game and the Jacksonville game, there's not a lot of good you can say about those games, but at least you can take a little solace in that those teams were red hot entering the contest against the Jets. You can't say that about Seattle. And Seattle's always a tough road venue to go to. As I said last week, it's one of the three loudest outdoor road venues in the NFL. It's up there with Kansas City and Denver. It's always been a difficult place going back to the Legion of Boom days, even before then. In the best days of Mike Holmgren's tenure with the Seahawks, it's always been a very difficult road venue, but just didn't show up in that game. Just didn't show up the last 2 weeks with everything riding on it. So it's tough for me to look back on this and just say, well, bad luck. Yeah, there was some bad luck along the way, but you have to fight through bad luck. And, you can't make excuses. And to their credit, the Jets are not making excuses, at least from what I've heard. The Jets are acknowledging that they failed. And you hope that this is the type of thing that teaches them. Through the early part of the season, the Jets were the best fourth quarter team in the NFL. I think that was true through the first half of the season. And there was a lot of discussion because the Jets had a pretty young core. It may not be a young roster overall per se, but the core players, the guys who are the stars, the guys who are the difference makers are pretty young. And there was a lot of talk about how the Jets were kind of a team that's played with experience beyond their years because they were not panicking in the fourth quarter of games. They were rising to the occasion. I wondered whether down the stretch you saw the Jets maybe show their youth a little bit. And you hope that this is the type of thing they learn from, because this thing could go one of two ways. This could be the type of end of the season that motivates you to go on to greater things in the future. And that's happened before, where teams suffer a late season collapse and it's just a catalyst for better things in the future. Or it could be the type of thing where, after the season, the momentum carries over and we could be looking at, I hate to say it, I don't want to say it, another failed rebuild. So nothing is guaranteed about the future. What I can say is that this is a disappointing season, even with the Jets having preseason expectations, even with the Jets really beating most objective preseason expectations and even matching my probably unobjective preseason expectations, because you're always optimistic going into the season. The Jets simply did not do enough. And, I always lean on the side of what could we have done more, because the stuff that's the luck, you just can't, that stuff you have to deal with. You have to figure out a way to work around it. And I don't think you can make excuses. So I think that those are reasons that help explain what happened, but you can't look back on that and say these are explicitly the reasons the Jets did not advance to the playoffs for the first time since 2010. Maybe it'll be 2023, and we are in 2023. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Tuesday, everybody. Send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will have our weekly mailbag.